Welcome back to another episode of SaaS Buyers Club. I'm your host, Omeed, and I'm the managing partner of Optimist Legal, which is a full service corporate boutique law firm for SaaS founders. We help SaaS founders with all things contracts, from incorporation to exit. Anything that has to do with contracts is what we help SaaS founders with. And I'm also the host of the SaaS Buyers Club podcast. And the SaaS Buyers Club podcast's mission is to give SaaS founders value so that they can increase the exit value of their business. Because I believe that anyone who can give value to SaaS founders will help them increase the values of their businesses so they can get great exits. That being said, I'm pleased to introduce James Wilton from Monovate. James helps SaaS founders make money. That's the best way that I can put it. And I believe former McKinsey as well.
That's right.
So thanks for joining, James.
Oh, great to be here, Omeed. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Yeah. So what do you want SaaS founders to get from the episode today?
Well, I'd love, I think what I've really dedicated my career to probably over the last 10 to 12 years really is helping companies find better ways to monetize their products, be able to capture more value through the pricing strategies that they build. So I'd hope that through our conversation, some SaaS founders leave here with a few different tips and things to think about that will help them capture more value and be more successful with their own monetization.
Cool. So how do most SaaS founders usually monetize their businesses?
Well, typically, I mean, I think you do see a lot of commonality between general SaaS models. I think that when you think SaaS pricing strategy, you immediately think users, right? Pricing based on seats. So whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4 seats, different prices for that, and you tend to think good, better, best for packaging. So just creating a simple tiered structure. And there are really good reasons why those tend to be the most commonly followed elements. But I think it's really important to remember that those aren't the only options that you have. And I think a lot of SaaS founders, when they start thinking about what pricing strategies could be, they tend to default to that because it's easy and that's within easy reach.
Is there an aspect too that maybe is SaaS is thought to be the most desirable type of like revenue generating business because of the recurring revenue?
Yeah.
And so people maybe don't know that there are ways to optimize within this kind of like best tier of type of revenue.
Yep, absolutely. Within that construct, I do. I think people are unaware of the amount of optionality that they have, and it's true, right? I mean, everybody wants recurring revenue for a reason, right? I mean, from the vendor side of it, I mean, it's great to know that you've got good, stable revenues coming in. You're able to forecast better and so forth. That's very good. It's very predictable. That's why, of course, you get great valuation multiples on SaaS because you know that recurring revenue is coming in. But it's also, in a lot of cases, it's good from the customer side as well because it's very if you do have certain revenue streams like the sort of pay-as-you-go usage base that people do talk about occasionally, the amount of customer could be paying on a month-to-month basis could be going up and down all over the place. And that can be good. If it's linked to value, that means, if I'm getting less value in month 2, then I pay less in month 2. So that feels good from that sense. But it's also very difficult to budget for, right? Like you don't know what you're going to be paying every single month, and that becomes difficult. So actually we find that a lot of the times customers would rather pay in that kind of recurring basis as well.
Is that the model that you usually recommend for SaaS founders to move to, from that kind of basic approach in terms of seat-based pricing and good, better, best, I think is the way that
Yeah. No, exactly. I mean, honestly, it's not that you always need to move away from that. I would say seat-based pricing and good, better, best. I mean, that is a model that is going to allow you to get recurring revenue, right? And it's something that's very simple to set up. Everybody's familiar with seats. Everybody knows what a seat means. So it's very familiar, and that means that you don't end up having to explain that a lot to customers. So there are some benefits from that point of view, right? Mm-hmm. The issue is that for all its benefits, in a lot of cases now, per user, like the per user metric is not aligned to how much value the company actually provides. The business provides. It's not the case that if I give you 5 user licenses, you're getting significantly more value than 1 user license in every case, and that kind of becomes a bit of a problem at some points. It means that,
Can you give me an example?
yeah, absolutely. Imagine you had like an online reference tool, right? Like, let's say there's some SaaS founder has produced a tool, which is this lookup tool. You can search and retrieve information there. And let's say that person has decided just to copy what most people are doing and charging per license for it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, search and retrieve tool, right? You're not getting value from that all the time, right? It's probably not something that you're using day in and day out and you always need. It's just like it's something which is there when you need it. So if I have one person who has access to this, that's great. Do I get twice the amount of value if 2 people have access to it? Maybe not, right? Because maybe actually like one person could manage all the search and retrievals for 2 people or 3 people or 4 people. So you end up in a situation when, if you're selling to budget conscious customers, if you're monetizing on this per user basis, then they may not purchase more user licenses because they find that they can actually get all the work done with 1 user.
Got it.
And that is actually part of a trend you're seeing more and more now, because we have so many more of these tools now which benefit from AI and automation in general. It means that one person can do the work that many people could do previously. So if you're charging on a number of seats, you're probably not going to be able to price differentiate very effectively and make sure that your customers with the highest willingness to pay are actually paying more, because they're going to be able to control their costs. It also becomes a bit of a problem for your positioning, right? Because ideally your value proposition and your pricing strategy should be reinforcing, right? You can say that I create value for you, the customer, in this way, and that's the way that I'm charging you. That all kind of rolls together. And if you're charging them based on how many users they have, but the value doesn't really scale that way, you're not really talking about the value as being related to the number of people who are using it. There's a disconnect, and it creates friction in that sales process. It doesn't work as well. So you really want to be thinking about, what are the other metrics that I could be picking that align better to value and might be better for me to be able to price differentiate across my customer base with. You can pick a different metric and it can still be recurring revenue, right? You're just using a different metric to scale that monthly or yearly price.
Okay. So I hear that a problem for SaaS founders is the value position and the actual value delivered based on the pricing model need to align.
Yep, absolutely.
So what advice do you have for SaaS founders to align their value proposition and their pricing model? How do you help SaaS founders do that?
I also think the first step is to think about, if you were, not saying you have to do the math here. I don't want to put anybody off with the talk of equations, but if you had to produce an equation to calculate how much value a customer got from your product, how would you build it? Would you say it's going to be, based off the amount of revenue that the customer has multiplied by a certain uplift that they're expecting to get from you, right? Or would you think about the number of people who are using it plus then like a value per user? Think about what really scales that value. And if you do that, you're going to end up with some variable, right? Which is either something about what they're doing or something about what they have as a company. It might be an element of their scale, which dictates how much value they get. And that's a really good starting point for thinking about what your ideal value metric or your price metric might be, right? So you can think about that then, and then start to think about what that price metric, see whether it fits all the other criteria that we would look for in building a good pricing metric for a SaaS pricing scheme. We've already talked about value alignment, which is really important, and that's how you got there. So that's going to drop out if you're doing it this way. But you also want the metric to be acceptable, So it should really be seen as something that's fair for you to set price based on. Ideally, it would be familiar. If you have a metric which is very acceptable as well as being value aligned, then that friction of selling to customers is going to be quite low. If the acceptability is not there, you're probably going to have to do a little bit of education before you get it to the point where customers are quite accepting of it. It doesn't mean you can't do it. It's just something that you should know about.
Mm.
You'd also ideally want it to be growth oriented as well, right? Because if you're going to set a price for a customer based on the value of a certain metric, whether it's users or usage or whatever else it is, if that number is the same on year 3 as it was on year 1, then your revenue is not going to grow year over year, right? And a lot of SaaS founders and businesses grow through this kind of land and expand approach. So it's very helpful if the metric that you tie the price to is just going to naturally increase in number of units over time. It comes as natural pathway to that. So you'd want it to be growth oriented. You'd also want it to be auditable, which means you can measure it and monitor it exactly. As an example of that, right? If you were say you were going to set price for a SaaS company based on the number of employees that they have, like, can you find out what their number of employees is? Is that going to be published somewhere where you can look at that number and see it and verify it? Because if you're reliant on the customer telling you, then it's going to slow down the sales process while they're getting that information to you. But also, it does give them the opportunity to lie in order to get a lower price, right? Like, oh no, we only have 20 employees, so that you'll give them a lower quote. That's going to reduce the viability of your pricing metric there. And I say the last couple of things to think about as well are how predictable and how controllable a metric is. Like, again, if I've decided that I'm selling to a company and the company serves a lot of consumers, if I decide that the amount of value to this company is going to be the usage of those consumers, that's great. That might be very value aligned, but also the company is going to have no control over how the users use it at all. So this metric is going to be then very unpredictable and not controllable, and means that on day one, when the company is buying this, it's going to be very hard for them to know exactly how much they're going to end up paying for it. So ideally, you want a metric which is more predictable, or even if it isn't, through the architecture, the way that you scale price with that metric, you have a way of making it more predictable or controlling it. So there's a lot of things to think about when you're doing that, but I think starting with value is a really good place to begin.
And you said some of the pricing models that align with value proposition is how much revenue we've generated for the company, for example. One of the considerations of determining value alignment. What are some of the other ones that you mentioned?
There's a few. I mean, honestly, I think one of the great things about the SaaS world right now is that because you can really set price any way you want. So there's this huge number of different metrics you could potentially pick. You can create your own metrics in some cases as well. So it's very difficult to sort of say, here's all the choices that you have. When my company Monovate is thinking about price metrics for companies, we always start thinking about categories of metrics as an anchoring point. So
okay, so like, what are some examples of the metrics and the categories?
Categories. So the first one would be user-based metrics, right? So this is the classic we just talked about: per user, per seat, per named user, which is a different spin on that, right? So you actually have to have a specific user license as opposed to a general one that you could share around. You can also get into hybrid usage metrics there, like number of active users. So, it's literally, I'm measuring the number of people who are actively using it. There's a whole bunch of different metrics within that space. Then there's usage metrics, which obviously are on the rise now. You're hearing a lot about usage-based.
Yeah,
now.
like token-based pricing. You buy tokens to use the product.
Exactly. Tokens, API calls, downloads, transactions, searches. It really depends on what your usage looks like within your product. But there's a myriad of different different options within that. I think closely related as well, there are we call them capacity-based metrics. And I think of Amazon web services when I think of that categories, because it's like, per gigabytes, it's the amount of storage, the amount of capacity that you have to serve it. So related, but separate to the usage-based. Then you get into the fourth category then, which is business-based. If you're serving a B2B company. And business-based is those things you were just talking about, Omeed, right? So, number of employees is a business-based metrics. The amount of revenue that they have is a business-based metric. Perhaps the amount of spend that they have in a particular category. All of those are viable price metrics in theory as well. I will say with revenue itself, it becomes a bit complicated because people tend to think that they can't set price based on a customer's revenue because it feels like they're just charging them different amounts based on how deep their pockets are, essentially, which it could be used in that way, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, I would say if your product was a marketing product, it helps your customers to increase the amount of revenue or leads or something they have, might make sense to set price based on the amount of revenue you have, because that's really what's going to scale the value. And then the last category would be output based here. And you're actually starting to see a lot more of these now with Gen AI. There's a couple of companies who have started to dip their toe in this, but I would say traditionally it's an idea which is aspirational. Like everybody would love to set price based on the output that my product actually gives you, but it's just very complicated to do in real life, right? Because you have to get your customer to agree that this is the right metric. You then have to get them to agree that any movement in this metric is due to what you, the vendor, is doing, as opposed to anything that they might be doing. You have to baseline it so that you can measure improvements from there, and so on and so on and so on, right? So it becomes a little practically difficult to do, but it's kind of pricing utopia if you can do it, because you're saying, I create value for you along this metric, and that's also how I'm charging you.
How is that different than usage-based pricing?
Well, usage-based may not be directly, it might be a step in the direction of value, but not directly related to value. So for example, you might say, let's say you have a product which sits on company websites and helps them find the products that they are looking for, and then they will buy those products when they find the right ones, right? A usage metric could be number of searches. So, you might say that the amount of value that I get is probably related to the amount of search activity that I have, because I'm using your product to search, which is what it's meant to do. But really, the customer gets value every time somebody makes a transaction and spends money on that transaction, right? So the output-based metric is probably going to be either the number of purchases or the total amount of dollars purchased. But number of searches is a value aligned usage based metric that's kind of an input to that process.
Okay. Yeah. So we just went through all of the different characteristics of pricing models, right? So there
was user based, there was usage based, capacity based, business based, and output based.
Got it. All right. So you wrote a book called Capturing Value.
Yep, I did.
And it's coming out on January 21st, 2025.
Correct.
And tell me about the book. What is the book about?
So the book it's really a guide to help SaaS founders and executives build pricing strategies for SaaS products, right? I mean, I will say that I've been in this space for about 12 years now. And what I always find is, you have SaaS startups, and it's very common for SaaS startups to have a ton of expertise in product, right? They have loads of really great product people who know how to build really great products. That's often a given within those. And as they start to scale, they often start to bring in really good talent in sales and marketing as well. It's very unusual for them to have people in there who know how to price their products. That's not usually something that's invested in. So, invariably, as they start to bring their product to market, they get to the point of like, oh, we need a pricing strategy, and they don't know how to do that. And if they start to go looking for it, right, there's very little good, reliable information out on the web or anywhere else where you can find stuff that tells you how to think about this, but also just the practically how to do it. And I think the result of that is, in a lot of cases, they just end up copying their competitors and just picking a pricing strategy very, very transactionally. And that's a mistake, right? Because your pricing strategy really should be something you think about strategically to help you achieve what your business wants to achieve, and make sure that you really do a good job of capturing a fair amount of the value which your product creates, which in most of these cases, these products are, super differentiated and interesting. So there's usually a lot of value at stake. You can end up losing it all just by not thinking about your pricing pricing correctly. So really capturing value, what that was it's a book that solves for all of that, really. It hopefully walks SaaS founders and executives all the way through all the steps and all the different components of pricing that they need to think about. It tells them how to think about those different areas. What's the mindset you need to get into? What are the principles that you need to lock onto? What options do you have? What are the pros and cons of each one of those? And then gives them practical steps of saying, if you need to go and do this, these are the steps that you should walk through to go and do it. So it's hopefully, it's a way of arming everybody with the information that they need to go and build a pricing strategy, which is going to do a lot better job of helping them capture the value that they create.
That sounds like a perfect topic for this conversation. So let's start with the steps. What are the steps?
There are different steps for all different sections, right? I mean, I think what I've done for the chapters is taken through every different part of the process, right? And every different part of the pricing structure. So there's firstly is about setting your objectives for your pricing. What are you trying to achieve? Which sounds so trivial, right? But it's actually really important because people tend to forget about that. People tend to think that if you're in a particular market space with a particular type of product, there's like a right and a wrong way to be pricing. And there really isn't, right? There's some conventions and there's things that are typically done. But I would say you got two products that are within the same space, selling to the same customers. Everything's identical about them, apart from one of those products is trying to maximize profitability right out of the gate, and the other one is more focused on getting early volume and worried about ramping up the monetization later. Those two products should have completely different pricing strategies. And I think that's important because most of the time, we don't just have one objective, right? A lot of the times we're saying, well, we really want to focus on revenue, but I don't want my profit margins to drop below this point, and I need to make sure my volume stays high. There's a lot of different things that we're trying to solve for. And pricing strategies that are going to support each one of those different objectives will often kind of be completely different from each other. So if you really want to be able to build a pricing strategy that's going to help you achieve what you want to achieve, you have to be very clear on what's the most important objective, what's second, etc. So that when you're choosing all the different elements of your pricing, you're thinking about those trade-offs across those different objectives. If you can just, this is my, I think, big hot take here, right? Like if you can just really think about your objectives, you've immediately set yourself up for building a better pricing strategy than you would do if you just didn't do that. So very, very simple and very powerful.
Do you think that SaaS founders know how to think about their objective? Like I think, okay, if I were to put myself in the shoes of a SaaS founder, for example, when I think about pricing, I want my company to make money. What other objectives are there other than that?
I think a lot of the time they do know, honestly. I think if you're super early stage, then yes, you're thinking about wanting to make money. But I often hear, relatively early stage SaaS founders saying, what's really important to us is, for the moment, we just want to really build the platform and get a base of, really supportive users, and then we'll worry about monetizing them, greater. Like that's part of their strategy that they're following to grow their business. And you do often hear other businesses saying, well, we've got really high cost to serve, and we need to make sure that whenever we're serving anybody, we're at least crushing over this profit threshold. So I don't really care about how many customers I have. I know that I just need to be able to charge at the level which is going to allow us to profitably serve them. Different scenarios for both, right? But they usually do think about that. I think where for me the disconnect is that although they have those objectives, they don't necessarily connect them to the pricing strategy and think the pricing strategy is something that's going to help me achieve these objectives. They tend to just think pricing is like a tactical thing that I just need to slap onto my product before I bring it.
And this guy over here who runs a similar company, has this pricing strategy, and
right, they did that. So let's do that.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So first step in the process is think about the objective. And as you mentioned, the objective, it could be a number of different things, like
many things. Yeah. Multifaceted, exactly. But lay all that down, get it super clear. And then you start thinking about different elements of your pricing strategy. So, you're thinking about packaging. We said that there's good, better, best is very common. And often it's a very good option, right? Because it is very simple. Customers get it. If your product isn't super advanced yet, it doesn't have a lot of different widgets, there's usually a sort of a level of product differentiation that you can do there. But it's not the only option, right? It's not the only thing to think about. You can also, I guess the simplest form of packaging is actually no packaging, right? Which means just giving them a one size fits all, take it or leave it. That's usually not the right thing to do, even if you're super early stage by the way, but it is an option. And then you get into more complex models, like sort of, you could have like a platform base plus modules that would stack on top of it. You can think about just having a pure modular thing. And you do start to see some more mature companies with just completely a la carte packaging, right? So you can just literally choose at almost a feature level, what level of service you have. But your objectives, again, are going to help to decide what's the right thing to do there, based on whether you're trying to grow volume or maximize profitability. Is going to push you to different levels there. But you also have to think about the way that your product is set up, and your customers, and how they think about value, and how much choice complexity they can tolerate. There's all these different factors that will come into it.
Mm.
You need to choose the right system for you, but then also build those packages the right way, which really takes a very intimate understanding of how customers think about value of those different features. Like if you're looking across your entire base of customers, how frequently is a particular feature valued? And if it is valued, what portion of those customers who value it would be willing to pay extra to get it if it didn't come as standard? You can start to do that, then you can start to classify your features as being foundational features that everybody needs versus premium features that probably belong in a higher tier versus niche features, which you're going to be better off actually monetizing as an add-on, just giving it to those people.
That's a deep understanding of customer, like buyer psychology, like to know these are the most important features of the product, and differentiate those. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think it's really important. You mentioned the customer specifically there, Omeed, and I think that's exactly right, because I would say a trap that a lot of growing SaaS companies fall into is they assume that they know what the customer is going to think of as important. It's like, if we think that our feature is going to be cool and worth paying for, customers will. Sometimes
Yeah.
that's the case, not always, So you have to understand how customers are going to think about it and package it according to the way that they're going to react to it.
So objectives, packaging,
Price metrics and architecture are another one as well. So we talked about price metrics, right? What is the metric, or that you scale the price of your product based on?
so usage, user, business, output.
Capacity. You got it. That was really good. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Those are options. And say that these are categories, right, rather than individual ones. So you want to really think, let me brainstorm some potential options across each of these categories, which I think could work for us based on the way that we create value for our customers, right? Get that list together, get it down, and then evaluate the short list that you have against those criteria that we talked about earlier, right? Is it value aligned? Is it growth oriented? Is it acceptable, etc.? You can do that. You can end up picking a really good metric that's gonna work for you. And then you go to the next step, which I guess would be the fourth one. That's right? We're on the fourth one, which is now saying that now that I have this price metric, I now still need to understand how this metric is going to scale the price. Like, is it just literally that I'm just going to have a price per unit and you just pay for the number of units in this kind of very linear way? Or is it that there's going to be some kind of a sliding scale, like the price per unit is going to decrease as the number of units increases? Or do I band it, right? Do I keep the price flat between certain numbers? There's a lot of different options that you can pick for that. And again, it's all going to come from, again, how predictable the customer needs the pricing to be, and how value scales along that metric. Just because a customer agrees that the value is going to increase as the number of units increases doesn't mean that the rate of value increasing is going to be the same regardless of how many units that you have, right? It might taper off. So you need to think that. When you've gone through all that, you have your price structure now, right? So you have your way of price differentiating. You have your packaging, which allows your customers to choose what they want. You have a system of scaling the price of those packages to customers who are at different scales, have different amounts of values. then you need to set your price levels as well. Right. So now you have to think about all those, like I would say the list price, which is the sticker price that you would set for your products at any particular level of that price structure. But then also the target price that you should be getting to when you actually sell it. I think understanding those two is really important as well, because your list price that you set, like the price it should cost, going to suggest value, right? So you don't want your list price to be too low or to be dropping or something, because it suggests that the value's coming out of it. But you know that in most situations when you're going to be selling a SaaS product, there's going to be discounting. You're going to go into a meeting and put your price on the table. The customer may not have had any idea what you were going to charge, and they just know that whatever he says, I'm going to immediately ask for 20, 25%, 30% off it. So if you can understand that dynamic, and there are different dynamics in different regions and different industries, then you can just set your list prices higher, right? So that after that sort of expected amount of discounting, you end up at the right price level, as opposed to putting the list price at the price level that you'd want to get, and then everything from there is a loss at that point. That's your setting your price levels. And then the last thing to think about within your price structure is that it's not that your price strategy ends when you set those prices. You then have to go out into the market and get it as well. So given that I'm trying to end up at this particular price level, how do I make sure that I don't end up discounting that all the way through the sales process? So you have to start thinking about how you support your sales teams and your go-to-market teams. That's usually a combination of rules. There's like the stick, right? You say that you cannot do certain things. You only have this amount of freedom. There are incentives, so you have things in place to encourage them to price at higher levels. And then there are enablers, and these are all the things that allow them to believe that they can get prices at higher levels, and that stops them from discounting. So that's the full gamut that you'd walk through, Omeed.
Cool. Those are the steps, right? Awesome.
Yep.
Thank you for walking me through that. I have actually been thinking about it, and I'm like, yeah, I see how all of the steps are connected to one another, because every time I have a guest on the show, yes, I run a law firm and I'm a lawyer, but I also see myself as an entrepreneur, and I've actually launched 2 software products as well. So as you're walking through these steps, I'm like, all right, what is my pricing objective? And then,
Right.
one of the big challenges with being in a service business is the lack of recurring revenue. So having to continuously go out there and get more and more clients.
Yep.
So I'm like, okay, that for sure is a pain point for the law firm. And so my objective would be to create, recurring revenue, which then, sets the model, right? Okay, subscription based is the easiest way to get recurring revenue. So the model would be subscription based on the objective, which is to create recurring revenue. And then from there, then I can start to look at understanding the client. Well, what is most important to clients? They love knowing that their lawyer is there. They just want to talk to them. They want,
Right.
and they want you to be like a genie. When they email you, you better respond immediately, because they love that, because it's a protection thing. They want to know hey, can I do this? Is it okay? This happened. What do you think? And so availability and contact and connection are really important in terms of metrics. Those would almost be premium features that they would be willing to pay for. So I'm literally sitting here going through all of the things. So yeah, awesome.
No, that's right.
Yeah,
exactly. And and this is, like we were talking about with Capture and Value. It's very much it's explicitly a book that is written for SaaS founders and SaaS executives and SaaS businesses, right? But it is, I'm a strong believer that good pricing is good pricing. You do hear certain people saying that B2C pricing is completely different from B2B pricing, and pricing in this industry segment is different from this segment. And that is true to an extent. There are tactical differences. You have to focus on slightly different elements. But if you really just boil it down to the essentials and the things you're thinking about, it's all the same, right? So you can really be looking at a book which tells you explicitly how to price in one particular space. If you really sort of go down to the core fundamentals, you can adapt it to other industry segments as well, as you just have to the legal industry.
I've had a guest on the show who calls it service as a software. Like, stop thinking about software as a service. It's actually more about the service that the software provides. And so it's actually
Yep.
more of service as a software.
Exactly.
So in that same way, you know, being a lawyer is so much more than being a lawyer. We're service providers. And so, yeah, I'm always like trying to build up lawyers because everyone like shoots down lawyers so much, you know? So I'm like trying to find a way to make lawyers cool. I think it's working.
Good. That's good. It's a noble cause.
Yeah.
I think it's an important point to call out as well. And I really like the way that you were talking about it, Omeed, because you did this implicitly. But I think when you do start to see some service providers try to get into subscription businesses, right? The mistake that they make is they try to provide something which is really kind of a one-time thing as a recurring offering, right? Which doesn't work because you're delivering the value in one fixed component as opposed to delivering the value on like an ongoing basis. Like, for example, I mean, my firm Monovate, we provide pricing strategy transformation services, and our core offering really is, we come in, we change your pricing strategy, and then we leave you to it, and you roll it out. So it's very much the value is provided through that transformation. It's not that we are continually adding value over 3 years. So if we were to come in and start saying, hey, we have a subscription for what we do, it would be very difficult for customers to get behind that. As much as we would love to have recurring revenue, right? That doesn't make sense. But what you were just talking about when you're a lawyer, right? And like part of it is the availability and being there and answering questions and this kind of consistent support. That, of course, that is a service that has this recurring component to it. So it fits very nicely into that recurring model. So you kind of want to be open to those subscription offerings for maybe types of business you wouldn't normally think about it, but also at the same time, don't force a square peg into a round hole.
Yeah. Yes. Love that point. Interesting. Okay. So just, I can't help it, but like, what would you say your objective with your pricing strategy for Monovate is?
Wow, you put me on the spot with that one. Yeah, well, it's an interesting one for us, right? Because I mean, Monovate, when I founded Monovate back in 2021, really having been at McKinsey for many years, where McKinsey obviously is seen as very premium, but typically works with very large companies who can afford their, quite high fees. And although I was in McKinsey working in a part of McKinsey that was focused on serving the startup space, so trying to serve these growing companies. And I always say, firm did try to make some concessions there, but it was always difficult making the fees work with these much smaller companies who just didn't have the budgets. So I think with our pricing strategy at Monovate, right, what I wanted to be able to do was to be able to work with these smaller companies who I was excited about working with. So you want to be able to have price levels that make it viable for them to actually do the work with you, but at the same time, we considered ourselves a premium service. We're still trying to do the work at this, this top level of consulting, McKinsey level standard of consulting. And so you don't want to drop it so low that they then start to think that the value is not there, right? Because it really does the price level signals value. So that's what we were trying to think about is, how do you balance that positioning piece to the realities of just being able to do business with those customers? How do you make sure you end up in the right place?
Thanks for walking me through that, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So let's talk mindset. So
Yes.
In your book, one of the things that you talk about in the book is mindset and how to think about pricing. Okay, so we've talked about some of the mindsets that SaaS founders usually have. They might say, hey, we want to, based on the objective, for example, because I feel like the objective and the mindset are somewhat related in terms of the objective emerges from the mindset. One mindset that we talked about that often SaaS founders have is, this competitor does it this way, so I'm just going to do it that way. Or the industry typically does it this way, and so I'm just going to do it that way. Or, it's like, we just need to make sure that, customers spend this much money, for example, so that we can, hit the threshold, for example. What are some other kind of mindsets that SaaS founders may have versus the mindsets that they should have?
That's a great question. I think probably the most frequent and well-intentioned, but ultimately destructive one that SaaS companies has is this the mindset they tend to have around product, because many SaaS companies are very product-led, right? Like they want they really want to create these great products, which is amazing. You tend to find your chief product officers and people working in there, get very passionate about the things that they are producing, the features and the capabilities that their product has. And the natural tendency is to want all the customers to have access to those things, right? And say like, oh, you can't get any value with this product unless you have that. That is actually the enemy of price differentiation in many cases, right? Because if you create these like great and special things and you just kind of roll that in a standard to everybody, then those people who would have paid extra in order to get that won't do it anymore because you just included it. So you really have to get into that mindset of like, I have to not just give away all the value that I am creating for too little. And also I have to sort of realize that there are some customers who would be happy to not get all the special stuff that I have developed in order to get a lower price, because that's more important for them. I forget who it was. It's there's a really classic quote around this. Whoever did the quote said something along the lines. He was talking about classes of seating in trains, and he said, I make economy class bad not to punish the poor, but to make the rich be willing to pay for the higher end. And that's really what it is, right? Like you need to have these systems of differentiation so that those customers who have higher willingness to pay have a reason to pay more for it. That's price differentiation is probably the most important principle in all of pricing. That's what really helps you capture more value from the market you're serving. So you have to be able to create those stratified options.
And so you said most destructive mindset is the one where SaaS founders just give their features away.
Yeah, the mindset of wanting their customers to have access to all of their features and all of the things that they've built.
Probably. Go ahead.
I was going to say very, very well intentioned, but ultimately destructive.
Yeah. Do they just not know that they can charge for it? Do they just like not think about it?
I think it's a little bit of both. In some cases, there are times where I think people, like, you hear this point of view of, well, I don't know why anybody would ever want this product if it didn't include this, because they're so sort of hell bent on the value of this thing that they've built, that without that, why would anybody want it? So that can be a piece of it. The other piece can just be, I'm mission driven. I built this product to help solve this problem. This feature or this set of capabilities really helps solve this problem. I want everybody to have access to this, which again, very, nice and well-intentioned thought, but ultimately destructive for monetization.
It's interesting though. The first one seems driven by a fear of churn.
Yeah, well, if they've already got the product, then yeah, it could be like, if they don't give this, then everybody's gonna leave. But also a fear of not adopting, right? If I don't include this, then nobody will buy it. Nobody will want it. And actually, most of the time, that's not true. Like a lot of the times, new products are positioned as a monolithic offering, right? Like here's all the stuff in there. Here's all the stuff in this in this product. Take it or leave it. And you often end up in situations where customers will say, well, I can't pay what you're asking for it. I can only pay this. And in that situation, then, the company has no real lever they can pull except for price. They can either just say, no, sorry, you can't have this, or they can reduce the price for the same offering and get, and make it work. But in many cases, if you were to create a lower tier, which has some of those really premium things taken out in order to get a lower price, not all the time, but a lot of times, customers would actually be willing to lose those things and just buy something which is a little bit scaled back, right? Not all customer needs are the same. And again, we talked earlier on about getting customer perceptions about value. Just because we consider a feature or a capability to be like critical path for a product working, doesn't mean that the customers are going to see it that way.
Yeah, makes sense. Actually, yeah, this is the crux of everything. I mean, SaaS founders need to know their customers in terms of what they would be willing to pay for and how much they would be willing to pay. How have you done that with SaaS founders before? How would you recommend that SaaS founders go and have those conversations? Is it as simple as saying, hey, we're thinking of launching this feature. Would you pay XYZ more than what you're paying now? Is it as just as simple as that?
Can be. I mean, it's certainly a data point that's worth getting in those cases. And I think a lot of times, actually, SaaS founders and people who create new products don't realize that if they don't know how much customers will be willing to pay for something, they can just ask them, right? I mean, that is great to have. You have to go in there and take it with a pinch of salt, right? Because you know that customers are going to be slightly biased in the answers that they give you. They obviously have an incentive for you to be for you to think that their willingness to pay is lower than it is. That said, I think a lot of times I've seen growing companies, when they do have a small amount of customers who are maybe using their product, or they have a bunch of potential customers who are really excited about their idea, they actually will say numbers that are higher than the company was expecting. So it's definitely information that's worth getting. When you are thinking about doing that, don't just ask, what would you be willing to pay for this? You should really firstly sort of get them anchored on value, try to get from them an understanding of, like, what would this mean to you if this product could do this, right? How much value would you see this as creating? What would it be worth to you to be able to do this? And then start asking them questions which don't just say, like, what is the price point? Try to get a range from them. And I think a Van Westendorp technique style of questioning works really well for this. So instead of just saying, what would you pay for this? You say, tell me a price level for this product I've just defined that you'd consider to be a bargain or inexpensive. It's a good deal at this point. Now tell me a price point that you consider to be starting to get expensive, but you would still consider buying at this price point. Now tell me a price point that is so expensive now that you would no longer consider buying it. You're out. And now tell me a price point that actually it's so low now that you'd start to question the value of that product. You've got that now. Now you've got like a really good idea of what the potential range for your pricing would be. And you can probably back into a relative, how likely would they be to buy it at these different price points, right? They're probably going to be very likely between that inexpensive and the starting to get expensive point. They're going to be less likely to buy it once you go past the getting expensive. And once the value starts to get questioning, you start to lose it there as well. So if you can do that for a few different customers who represent a few different segments, you can start thinking about how well these different price levels are going to be perceived by those different segments. And that really gets you into a good starting point for your overall price levels.
Awesome. That's super helpful. James, thanks so much for joining me on the show this week. Really appreciate all the information you shared.
I'm very happy to. Enjoyed the conversation, Omeed. Thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely. For everyone out there, you'll be able to find James's contact information, ways to reach him in the show notes below. And as always, this has been another episode of SaaS Buyers Club. Thanks so much for joining, and I'll see you next week.